Thomas Whitaker had been farming corn in Millbrook for 15 years. His family owned 200 acres of prime farmland on the east side of town, land that his grandfather had purchased back in the 1950s. Thomas took pride in his work. Every spring he'd plant his seeds in perfectly straight rows. Every summer, he'd tend to his crops like they were his own children. And every fall he'd harvest golden corn that fed families across 3 counties. Right next door, separated only by an old wooden fence, lived Samuel Chen. Samuel's farm was slightly smaller, about 180 acres, but what it lacked in size it made up for in ambition. Samuel grew soybeans and he'd built his operation from scratch after moving to Millbrook 12 years ago. He'd worked day and night to prove himself in a town where most farmers came from families who'd been there for generations. At first, the two men got along just fine. They'd wave to each other across the fence line. They'd chat at the hardware store about weather patterns and soil conditions. Their wives would exchange recipes at the grocery store. It was neighborly, the way small-town life was supposed to be. But then came the county fair 3 years back. Both Thomas and Samuel entered their crops in the competition. It was supposed to be friendly, just farmers showing off their hard work, maybe winning a ribbon to hang in the barn. Thomas had won that category for the past 5 years running. Everyone expected him to win again. But that year Samuel's soybeans took first place. Thomas came in second. Now losing a county fair competition shouldn't have been a big deal. It was just a ribbon, just bragging rights. But Thomas didn't see it that way. He'd spent months preparing his best corn. He'd been so sure of winning that he'd already cleared a spot on his wall for another blue ribbon. When the judge announced Samuel's name instead, something shifted inside Thomas. He felt embarrassed. He felt like the whole town was watching him fail. After that day, things changed between the two farmers. Thomas stopped waving across the fence. He'd see Samuel working in his fields and deliberately look the other way. At the hardware store, if Samuel was in one aisle, Thomas would go to another. It was petty, and deep down Thomas knew it. But his pride had been wounded. Samuel noticed the cold shoulder, and it hurt his feelings. He'd worked so hard to be accepted in Millbrook, to prove that he belonged there. Winning that ribbon had meant everything to him. But now his neighbor, the man whose family had deep roots in the community, was treating him like an enemy. Samuel's competitive nature kicked in. If Thomas wanted to be unfriendly, fine. Samuel would show him what real competition looked like. The following spring, both men bought new equipment. Thomas purchased a fancy new tractor at auction. 2 days later, Samuel bought an even bigger one. When Thomas installed a new irrigation system, Samuel installed one that covered more ground. They started undercutting each other's prices at the farmer's market. If Thomas sold his corn for $3 a bushel, Samuel would sell his soybeans for a little less than market value just to attract more customers. The rivalry spilled over into town meetings. When Thomas proposed a new farming co-op to share equipment costs, Samuel stood up and criticized every detail of the plan. When Samuel suggested changes to the local water rights regulations, Thomas fought against it tooth and nail, even though the changes probably made sense. Their wives stopped talking completely. Linda Whitaker and Patricia Chen used to be friendly, but now they'd avoid each other at church. If they ended up in the same checkout line at the grocery store, one of them would move to a different line. It was awkward for everyone who knew them. The children suffered too. Thomas and Linda's son Jake was the same age as Samuel and Patricia's daughter May. The kids had played together when they were younger. But now both sets of parents had made it clear that fraternizing with the enemy family wasn't acceptable. Jake and May would see each other at school and quickly look away, pretending they didn't know each other. The whole town of Millbrook knew about the feud. At the diner, people would gossip about the latest incident. Did you hear Thomas complained about Samuel's fence encroaching on his property line? Did you hear Samuel reported Thomas for burning brush too close to the property boundary? The stories kept coming, each one more petty than the last. People started taking sides. Some of the older farming families sided with Thomas. They'd known his grandfather, respected his family's legacy in the community. Some of the newer residents sided with Samuel. They admired his determination, his willingness to innovate and try new techniques. The division spread through Millbrook like cracks in dry soil. At the local feed store, the owner had to schedule different delivery times for the two farmers to avoid confrontations. The bank manager dreaded days when both men came in for business. Even the pastor at Millbrook Community Church had tried to mediate, inviting both families to a reconciliation meeting. Neither showed up. What had started as a simple competition at a county fair had grown into something much bigger. It poisoned the atmosphere of a town that had always prided itself on community spirit. Old friends found themselves on opposite sides of arguments. Business partnerships dissolved. The annual town picnic became uncomfortable because people had to choose which farmer to sit near. Thomas told himself he was in the right. Samuel had come into his town, onto land right next to his family's property, and acted like he owned the place. That fair competition had been rigged somehow. His corn had been better. Everyone knew it. Samuel told himself a different story. He'd worked twice as hard as anyone else to build his farm. He'd won that ribbon fair and square. Thomas was just the entitled man who couldn't handle losing for once in his life. If Thomas wanted war, Samuel was ready to fight. Neither man could remember anymore what they'd actually liked about farming in the first place. The joy of working the land, watching things grow, being part of a community that supported each other through hard seasons, all of that had been buried under layers of resentment and pride. The fence line between their properties had become more than just a boundary marker. It was a battle line, and neither Thomas nor Samuel could see that their war was hurting everyone around them, including themselves. Late August arrived with the kind of heat that made everything shimmer in the distance. Thomas stood in his cornfield, running his hand along the tall stalks. The ears were heavy and nearly ready for harvest. Maybe 2 more weeks, he thought. The weather forecast looked good. Clear skies, warm days, cool nights. Perfect conditions for the final stage of growth. Samuel was in a similar position with his soybeans. His crop was about 2 weeks away from harvest as well. The pods were filling out nicely, and if everything went according to plan, this would be his best yield yet. He'd already lined up buyers and negotiated good prices. This harvest would finally give his family some financial breathing room after years of pouring every penny back into the farm. But weather in farm country is never guaranteed. On the evening of August 23rd, the sky started to change. Dark clouds rolled in from the west, much darker than normal. The local weather service issued warnings about severe storms. Heavy rain, possible flooding in low-lying areas, winds up to 50 miles per hour. Thomas brought his equipment into the barn and secured everything that could blow away. He'd been through storms before. His land had good drainage, and his crops were sturdy enough to handle some wind and rain. He went to bed that night listening to rain hammer against the roof, but he wasn't too worried. Samuel did the same preparations, but he felt more anxious. Part of his property sat lower than Thomas's land. There was a drainage ditch that ran along the western edge of his soybean fields, and when it rained hard, that ditch could overflow. He'd reinforced it last spring, but you never really knew how things would hold up until the water came. The storm hit around midnight. It wasn't just rain. It was a wall of water that seemed to come from every direction at once. Thunder shook the windows. Lightning lit up the sky every few seconds. The wind bent trees nearly in half. Both families lay awake in their beds, listening to nature's fury and hoping their crops would survive. By morning, the storm had passed. Thomas walked out to inspect his fields as soon as it was light enough to see. He had damage, no question about it. Some of his corn stalks had been knocked down by the wind. There were pools of standing water in a few spots, but overall his crops had survived. He'd lose maybe 10% of his yield. It hurt, but it wasn't devastating. His drainage system had done its job. Samuel walked out to check his fields with a knot of dread in his stomach. What he saw made his heart sink. The drainage ditch had overflowed badly. Water covered about 15 acres of his soybean crop. Not just puddles. Deep standing water, at least 6 inches in some places, pooling across his fields with no way to drain. He stood there staring at the water, doing calculations in his head. Soybeans can't survive in standing water for long. The roots start to rot. You've got maybe 72 hours before the damage becomes permanent. After that, you lose everything. Not just the yield from those 15 acres, but the time, the seed cost, the fertilizer, the fuel, the equipment hours. Everything. Patricia came out to stand beside him. She didn't say anything at first. She just took his hand and squeezed it. They'd put everything into this crop. They'd taken out a loan to buy better seeds this year. They'd invested in new equipment. This harvest was supposed to pay off those debts and finally get them ahead. Now looking at that standing water, Samuel was calculating how much they'd lose. 15 acres didn't sound like much, but it represented about 40% of their total crop. Losing that meant they'd barely break even for the year. They might not be able to make their loan payments. They might have to sell equipment. Patricia worked part-time at the library in town, but that income wasn't enough to cover a loss like this. Samuel grabbed his phone and started making calls. He needed pumps, big industrial pumps that could move massive amounts of water quickly. He needed them right now, not tomorrow or next week. He called every equipment rental place within 50 miles. Same answer from all of them. It was harvest season. Every pump was already rented out. The storm had caused flooding in 3 counties. Everyone needed pumps. He called contractors who specialized in drainage work. No one was available. One guy said he might be able to get out there in 5 days. That was too late. Samuel explained the situation, practically begged, but the contractor couldn't help. He was already committed to other emergency jobs. By noon, Samuel had called 23 different places. No luck. He sat on his front porch steps with his phone in his hand, staring at his flooded fields. The sun was out now, bright and hot, like the storm had never happened. That water was just sitting there, slowly killing his crop while he watched helplessly. Jake, Thomas's son, was riding his bike past Samuel's property on his way home from a friend's house. He saw the flooding and stopped. Even though his dad had forbidden him from talking to the Chen family, curiosity got the better of him. He could see how bad it was. The whole section of soybeans was underwater. When Jake got home, he found his dad in the barn, working on repairing some storm damage. Without thinking about the consequences, Jake said, "Mr. Chen's fields are really flooded. Like really bad. There's water everywhere on the west side." Thomas grunted but didn't respond. He kept working on the piece of equipment in front of him. But Jake noticed his dad had stopped moving for just a second when he heard the news. Then he continued working, like nothing had been said. That evening, Thomas drove past Samuel's property on his way back from town. He told himself he wasn't going to look, but he did anyway. He could see the standing water clearly from the road. He knew exactly what that meant. He'd been farming long enough to recognize a disaster when he saw one. Part of him, the part that had been angry for 3 years, felt a small sense of satisfaction. Samuel had been so cocky, so confident. Now he was getting a taste of how hard farming could be. Maybe this would humble him a bit. Maybe this would teach him that success wasn't guaranteed. But there was another part of Thomas, a part he'd been ignoring for a long time, that felt different. That part remembered being a young farmer himself, struggling to make it work. That part remembered his own father telling him that farmers stick together because nature is hard enough, without making enemies of your neighbors. That part looked at those flooded fields and felt sympathy, even compassion. Thomas drove home and tried to put it out of his mind. He had his own storm damage to deal with, his own crops to worry about. Samuel's problems weren't his responsibility. They weren't even friends. They were rivals, competitors, sometimes enemies. But that night at dinner, Thomas was quiet. Linda noticed but didn't ask. Jake glanced at his father a few times, wondering if he should have mentioned the flooding. The food tasted fine, but Thomas barely noticed what he was eating. His mind kept going back to those fields, to that standing water, to the clock ticking down on Samuel's crop. After dinner, Thomas went out to his barn. He had industrial pumps, good ones, 3 of them in fact. He'd bought them years ago for exactly this kind of situation. He also had generators to power them, long hoses to move the water, everything needed to drain a flooded field. His equipment was just sitting there in his barn while Samuel's crop died in standing water less than half a mile away. Thomas stood in his barn for a long time that night, just looking at those pumps. He could save Samuel's crop. He had the equipment and the knowledge to do it. But did he want to? Did he owe Samuel anything after 3 years of rivalry and bitterness? Would helping Samuel make him look weak? Would people think he was giving up the fight? These questions rolled around in his mind as the sun set and darkness filled the barn. Somewhere across the fence line, Samuel was probably lying awake too, trying to figure out a solution that didn't exist. The clock was ticking. By tomorrow night, 36 hours would be gone. By the next day, it would be too late. Thomas turned off the barn lights and walked back to the house, still undecided. The hardest decisions in life aren't between good and bad. They're between what pride wants and what conscience demands. Thomas didn't sleep well that night. He kept waking up every hour or two, his mind churning through the same arguments over and over. Around 4 in the morning, he gave up trying to sleep and went downstairs to make coffee. He sat at the kitchen table in the dark, watching the clock on the wall tick forward. Each minute that passed was another minute of Samuel's crop dying in standing water. Linda came down around 5:30 and found him sitting there with his third cup of coffee. She didn't ask what was wrong. After 22 years of marriage, she could read her husband pretty well. She poured her own coffee and sat down across from him. They sat in silence for a while, just being together in the early morning quiet. Finally, Linda spoke. "You're thinking about Samuel's fields. It wasn't a question." Thomas nodded. "I've got the equipment to fix it," he said quietly. "The pumps, the generators, everything. I could have that water drained in 2 days, maybe less." Linda took a sip of her coffee. But we haven't spoken in 3 years. We're not friends. We're barely civil to each other in public. He's never asked me for help. He probably doesn't want my help. And if I go over there, what does that say? That I'm weak? That I'm giving up whatever this thing is between us?" Linda set down her coffee cup and looked at her husband directly. "Can I ask you something? What would you want him to do if your positions were reversed?" The question hit Thomas like cold water. He opened his mouth to answer, then closed it again. He knew the answer. If his crops were dying and Samuel had the equipment to save them, Thomas would want him to help. No matter their history, no matter their rivalry, he'd want his neighbor to do the right thing. "That's different," Thomas said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Is it?" Linda asked. "How?" Thomas couldn't answer. He stared into his coffee cup like it might have some wisdom to offer. The truth was, it wasn't different. Not really. He was just scared. Scared of looking foolish. Scared of being rejected. Scared of admitting that he'd let a stupid rivalry go on for way too long. "Remember why you became a farmer?" Linda asked softly. "You used to tell me it was about the land, yes, but also about community. About being part of something bigger than yourself. About neighbors helping neighbors get through hard times. When did you forget that?" Thomas felt something crack inside his chest. His wife was right. Somewhere along the way, he'd stopped being the man his father raised him to be. His father would have been ashamed of this 3-year grudge. His grandfather, who'd bought this land and welcomed every new farmer to the area, would have been disappointed. He thought about his son, Jake. What kind of lesson was he teaching? That pride mattered more than doing what's right. That competition was more important than compassion. Was that really the legacy he wanted to leave? The sun was starting to come up now, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. Thomas stood up and walked to the window, looking out toward Samuel's property. He couldn't see the flooded fields from here, but he knew they were there. He knew that with every passing minute the damage was getting worse. "I'm scared," Thomas admitted, still looking out the window. "What if he tells me to get lost? What if he thinks I'm doing this to lord it over him somehow? What if this makes everything between us even worse?" Linda came to stand beside him. "What if it doesn't? What if this is the moment that changes everything? You won't know unless you try. And honestly, does it matter what he thinks? You'll know you did the right thing. Isn't that enough?" Thomas turned to look at his wife. She'd always been his moral compass, the person who kept him grounded when his pride tried to lead him astray. He pulled her into a hug and held on tight. "When did you get so wise?" he asked. "I've always been wise," she said with a small laugh. "You've just been too stubborn to listen." Thomas pulled back and nodded. "I'm going to do it. I'm going to help him." "I know," Linda said. "I knew you would. You're a good man even when you're trying hard not to be." Thomas went upstairs to get dressed. He pulled on his work jeans, his boots, a flannel shirt. Farm clothes, ready for a hard day's work. When he came back downstairs, Jake was in the kitchen eating cereal. The boy looked surprised to see his father dressed for field work so early. "We're going over to the Chen farm," Thomas announced. Jake's spoon stopped halfway to his mouth. "We're what?" "We're going to help Samuel drain his fields. Go get dressed. Wear your work boots. This is going to take a while." Jake just stared at his father like he'd grown a second head. "But Dad, you hate Mr. Chen. You said we're not supposed to talk to their family. You said—" "I said a lot of things I shouldn't have said," Thomas interrupted. "Now go get dressed. We've got work to do." Jake scrambled upstairs, excited and confused in equal measure. This was the most unexpected thing his father had ever done. Linda kissed Thomas on the cheek. "I'm proud of you. she said simply. Thomas went out to the barn and started loading equipment onto his truck. The big industrial pumps were heavy, but adrenaline made the work easier. He loaded 3 pumps, 2 generators, coils of heavy-duty hoses, tools, spare fuel cans. Everything they'd need for an emergency drainage operation. Jake came running out, properly dressed for farm work. Together, they secured the equipment in the truck bed, making sure everything was strapped down tight. The sun was fully up now. It was going to be another hot day. That standing water would be getting warmer by the hour, making conditions even worse for the soybeans. Thomas climbed into the driver's seat. Jake got in on the passenger side. For a moment, Thomas just sat there with his hands on the steering wheel, not starting the engine. This felt like a bigger moment than it should have been. He was just going to help a neighbor. That's what farmers did, but it felt like more than that. It felt like he was choosing what kind of man he wanted to be. He started the engine and pulled out of the driveway. The drive to Samuel's place took less than 3 minutes. They shared a property line after all, but it felt longer. Thomas's heart was pounding. His mouth was dry. He had no idea what he was going to say. Should he apologize first? Should he just start unloading equipment? Should he explain himself? As they pulled into Samuel's driveway, Thomas could see the flooded fields clearly. It was worse than he'd thought. The water was deep and covered more ground than Jake had described. This was going to take serious work, but it was definitely doable. His equipment could handle this. Samuel's house was a modest 2-story farmhouse similar to Thomas's own. There was a porch on the front where Samuel liked to sit in the evenings. Thomas had seen him out there countless times over the years, though they'd stopped acknowledging each other long ago. Thomas put the truck in park but didn't turn off the engine yet. He sat there, hands gripping the wheel, trying to find the courage to get out. Jake looked at his father with curiosity and concern. "Dad, are we going to just sit here?" Before Thomas could answer, the front door of the house opened. Samuel stepped out onto the porch. He was already dressed for the day, though he looked like he hadn't slept much. When he saw Thomas's truck in his driveway loaded with equipment, confusion crossed his face. Then something else. Suspicion maybe, or hope? It was hard to tell. Thomas turned off the engine. The sudden silence felt heavy. He looked at his son. "Stay in the truck for a minute," he said. Then he opened the driver's door and stepped out. Samuel came down the porch steps slowly. He stopped about 10 feet from the truck, his arms crossed over his chest. His expression was guarded. "What are you doing here, Thomas?" he asked. Thomas swallowed hard. This was it. The moment where he either took a step toward making things right or made everything worse. He could feel his pride trying to get in the way, trying to come up with some excuse or defensive comment. But he pushed it aside. "I'm here to help you save your crop," Thomas said, his voice steadier than he felt. "I've got pumps, generators, everything we need to drain those fields. We don't have time to waste. So we can either stand here and talk about the past 3 years, or we can get to work. Your choice." Samuel stood there frozen. Thomas could see about a dozen different emotions crossing his face. Surprise, confusion, suspicion, gratitude, anger, relief. For what felt like forever but was probably only 30 seconds, neither man moved. The morning air was still and quiet except for some birds singing in the distance. Then Samuel did something Thomas didn't expect. His eyes filled with tears. Not crying exactly, but close. "Why?" Samuel asked, his voice rough with emotion. "After everything, why would you help me?" Thomas looked at Samuel standing there with watery eyes, and for the first time in 3 years, he really saw him. Not as a rival or competitor, just as a man. A farmer like himself, facing a disaster that could destroy everything he'd worked for. A human being who was scared and desperate and trying to hold himself together. "Because it's the right thing to do," Thomas said simply. "And because somewhere along the way I forgot what being a farmer and a neighbor really means. I'd like to start remembering." Samuel wiped at his eyes with the back of his hand and nodded. He seemed unable to speak for a moment. Then he took a deep breath and walked toward Thomas, extending his hand. Thomas shook it. Neither man said anything else. They didn't need to. That handshake said everything. "Jake, come on out," Thomas called. "We've got work to do." Jake climbed out of the truck, excited but trying to act professional. At 16, he was old enough to do real farm work, and he took it seriously. Samuel's daughter May heard the commotion and came out to see what was happening. When she saw Jake, she looked surprised but smiled a little. They'd been friends as children, before the rivalry pulled their families apart. May, run and wake up your mother, Samuel said. Tell her we're going to need lots of water and food today. This is going to take a while. And call the Miller family. Tell them what's happening and see if they can spare anyone to help. Within an hour, the operation was in full swing. Thomas and Samuel worked together to position the first industrial pump at the edge of the flooded area. They ran a heavy hose from the pump across the field to a spot where the drained water could flow safely away, without causing problems elsewhere. Thomas showed Samuel how to prime the pump and get it running. The sound of the motor starting up was beautiful. Water began flowing through the hose immediately, a steady stream of salvation. We'll need all 3 pumps running, Thomas explained. That's a lot of water to move and we're racing the clock. The longer those roots sit in standing water, the more damage happens. But we can do this. I've seen worse situations turn around. They set up the second pump on the opposite side of the flooded area. Jake and Samuel worked on that one while Thomas prepared the third. The generators rumbled. The pumps churned. Water poured out of the fields in steady streams. It was loud, mechanical music, but to Samuel it sounded like hope. Patricia came out with sandwiches and a cooler full of water bottles around mid-morning. She stopped short when she saw Thomas working alongside her husband. Linda had called her to explain what was happening, but seeing it was different. Patricia walked over to Thomas, who was adjusting a hose connection, and tapped him on the shoulder. When he turned around, she hugged him. Just grabbed him in a quick, fierce hug. "Thank you," she said into his ear. Then she let go and went to help distribute water to everyone working. Word spread through Millbrook fast. Small towns are like that. Everyone knows everything by lunchtime. The Miller family arrived around noon with their own son, bringing extra fuel for the generators. Old Robert Murphy, who'd retired from farming 5 years ago, showed up with tools and spare parts just in case something broke down. He'd heard what Thomas was doing and wanted to be part of it. By early afternoon, there were 8 people working on saving Samuel's crop. They worked in shifts, monitoring the pumps, adjusting hoses, digging small channels to help the water flow better. The sun beat down hard and everyone was sweating through their shirts, but nobody complained. There was something powerful about working together for a common good. Thomas and Samuel found themselves standing side by side, watching the water levels slowly drop. They'd been at it for 8 hours straight, stopping only to eat or drink. Both men were exhausted but determined to see this through. "I owe you an apology," Samuel said suddenly. "For the past 3 years, I let my pride turn a small competition into something ugly. That wasn't right." Thomas shook his head. "I'm just as guilty. More, probably. I threw the first cold shoulder. I started this whole mess because I couldn't handle losing a county fair ribbon." "How stupid is that?" "Pretty stupid," Samuel agreed, then laughed. Thomas laughed too. It felt good to laugh together. It felt like releasing 3 years of tension all at once. "Can I ask you something?" Thomas said. "Why was winning that fair competition so important to you?" Samuel thought for a moment before answering. "When we moved here, I felt like an outsider. My family didn't go back generations like most folks in Millbrook. I wasn't born into farming. I chose it. And I wanted so badly to prove that I belonged here, that I could be successful, that I deserved respect. Winning that ribbon felt like validation, like the community was accepting me." Thomas felt a pang of guilt. "And then I made you feel unwelcome all over again." "And I responded by being competitive and aggressive, which probably confirmed whatever negative thoughts you had about me," Samuel said. "We both messed up, but we're fixing it now." They worked through the afternoon and into the evening. Patricia and Linda brought dinner out to the fields. Fried chicken, potato salad, biscuits. Everyone sat on the grass at the edge of the flooded area, eating and watching the pumps do their work. The water level had dropped noticeably. What had been 6 inches deep that morning was now maybe 3 inches in most places. Jake and May sat together, talking and laughing like old friends reconnecting after a long time apart. Their parents watched with bittersweet feelings. 3 years of friendship stolen from these kids because of adult stubbornness, but at least they could be friends again now. As the sun set, Robert Murphy came over to where Thomas and Samuel were checking on one of the pumps. "You know," he said, "the whole town is talking about this. What you two are doing here. It's reminded a lot of folks what Millbrook used to be like, before all the divisions and taking sides." "What do you mean?" Samuel asked. "Well, when your rivalry got bad, it split the town," Robert explained. "People chose sides. It made everything uncomfortable. But today, watching you two work together to solve a problem, it's like people remembered why we live in a small town in the first place. To look out for each other, to be community. Thomas hadn't thought about it that way. He'd been so focused on his rivalry with Samuel that he hadn't considered how it affected everyone else in Millbrook. But Robert was right. Their feud had forced other people to choose sides, creating divisions throughout the town. "I'm sorry about that," Thomas said to Robert and to Samuel. "I never meant to hurt the whole community." "We both did it," Samuel said. "But maybe we can fix that too." The work continued through the night. They ran the pumps 24 hours, taking shifts to monitor everything and make sure nothing broke down. Thomas took the midnight to 4 a.m. shift. Samuel took 4 to 8. The Miller boy and Jake switched off helping. It was exhausting work, but there was a rhythm to it. And there was something almost meditative about being out in the fields at night, listening to the steady hum of the pumps, watching the stars overhead. Around 3 in the morning, during Thomas's shift, Samuel came out with 2 cups of coffee. "Couldn't sleep," he said, handing one to Thomas. "Figured you might want some company." They sat on the tailgate of Thomas's truck, drinking coffee and talking. Really talking for the first time in years. They talked about farming, about the challenges of making a living from the land. They talked about their families, their kids, their hopes for the future. They talked about how silly their rivalry seemed now, looking back on it. "You know what the craziest part is?" Thomas said. "I actually respect the hell out of what you've built here. Coming to a new place, starting from scratch, building a successful farm. That takes guts and skill. I should have told you that years ago instead of treating you like competition. And I should have respected your family's history here instead of trying to prove I was better," Samuel said. "You've got knowledge and experience that I could have learned from if I hadn't been so proud and defensive." By the morning of the 3rd day, the transformation was remarkable. The standing water was gone. The fields were damp but draining properly now. Samuel walked through his soybean crop with Thomas, examining the plants carefully. Most of them looked okay. The roots were stressed but not rotted. They'd survived. "I think we did it," Samuel said, hardly believing it. "I think the crop is going to make it." Thomas clapped him on the shoulder. "Told you we could save it." Though it was closer than I'd have liked. They started breaking down the equipment, loading the pumps back onto Thomas's truck. The generators had burned through a lot of fuel, and everyone was exhausted, but there was a feeling of accomplishment in the air. They'd faced a crisis together and won. As Thomas was loading the last pump, Samuel stopped him. "I can't pay you for this. Not right now. The harvest money won't come in for a few more weeks, but I will pay you. Every penny this equipment rental would have cost, plus your time." Thomas shook his head. "I don't want your money, Samuel. That's not why I did this." "Then what do you want?" Thomas thought about it. "I want us to be neighbors again. Real neighbors. The kind who help each other out and don't keep score. That's all." Samuel's harvest came in 3 weeks later. The soybeans that had been underwater survived and produced a decent yield. Not his best crop ever, but solid. More importantly, it was enough to pay his debts and keep the farm running. The fields that Thomas had helped save produced good quality beans that buyers were happy to purchase. On the day Samuel finished his harvest, he drove over to Thomas's farm with a gift. It was a simple wooden sign that he'd carved himself. It read, "Good neighbors make good fences, but great neighbors help you over them." Thomas hung it in his barn where he'd see it every day. But the real change wasn't in wooden signs or saved crops. It was in how the two families interacted. Within a week of the rescue, the Whitakers and the Chens were having dinner together. Linda and Patricia rekindled their friendship like no time had passed. Jake and May became close friends again, and soon they were inseparable at school. Thomas and Samuel started coordinating their equipment purchases. If Thomas needed a piece of machinery that Samuel already owned, Samuel would loan it out. When Samuel was looking to buy new equipment, Thomas would share his research and experience. They saved each other thousands of dollars by sharing resources instead of competing to have the biggest and best of everything. One evening in early October, both families were sitting on Samuel's porch watching the sunset. The kids were playing in the yard. The adults were discussing the upcoming winter and plans for next year's planting season. It felt natural, like this was how things had always been. Like the 3 years of rivalry had been a bad dream that was finally over. "You know what we should do?" Samuel said suddenly. We should go to the next town meeting together and apologize to everyone for letting our rivalry divide the community. Thomas considered it. Town meetings in Millbrook could be intimidating. Everyone would be there. Everyone would be watching. But Samuel was right. They owed the town an apology. Yeah, Thomas agreed. Let's do it. The next town meeting was the following Thursday. The community center was packed, as it usually was. People took their regular seats. The Johnson family on the left side, the Robertsons on the right, the Millers in the middle. Everyone had their spot. But when Thomas and Samuel walked in together, conversation stopped. People watched with curiosity as the two former rivals sat down next to each other in the front row. Mayor Henderson ran through the usual business. Budget updates, road repair schedules, planning for the annual holiday parade. Then he opened the floor for community concerns. Thomas and Samuel stood up together. "We'd like to say something," Thomas announced. The room got very quiet. Samuel spoke first. "Most of you know that Thomas and I haven't gotten along for the past 3 years. We turned a friendly competition into something ugly. And in doing that, we hurt this community. We forced people to take sides. We made gatherings uncomfortable. We set a bad example for our kids and for anyone watching," Thomas continued. "A few weeks ago, I had a choice to make. Samuel's crops were in danger and I had the equipment to help. I almost didn't do it. I almost let my pride and our rivalry stop me from doing what was right. But my wife asked me a simple question. What would I want him to do if our positions were reversed? And I knew the answer. What happened after that showed us both what this community is really about," Samuel said. "It's not about who has the biggest farm or who wins at the county fair. It's about people taking care of each other. When Thomas showed up to help me, other people joined in. The Millers, Robert Murphy, folks we'd never even met before. Everyone came together to solve a problem." Thomas took a deep breath before continuing. "So we're here to apologize to all of you for letting our stubbornness divide this town, for making you feel like you had to choose sides, for forgetting what Millbrook is supposed to be about. We're sorry, and we're going to do better." The room was silent for a moment. Then old Robert Murphy stood up and started clapping. Within seconds, the entire room was applauding. Some people were wiping their eyes. Mayor Henderson had to clear his throat a few times before he could speak. "Well," the mayor said, "I think I speak for everyone when I say we're glad to have our community back. Thomas, Samuel, thank you for having the courage to make this right." After the meeting, people came up to both men to shake their hands or pat them on the back. Mrs. Rodriguez, who ran the diner, said she'd been so stressed about which farmer to seat where that she'd considered rearranging her entire restaurant. Now she wouldn't have to worry about it anymore. Everyone laughed at that. The story of what happened spread beyond Millbrook. The county newspaper sent a reporter to interview Thomas and Samuel. The headline read, "When Rivals Became Brothers, A Lesson in Community." Other papers picked up the story. Thomas and Samuel did a few interviews, always emphasizing the same message. Pride and rivalry aren't worth losing your community over. The county fair came around again that fall. Both Thomas and Samuel entered their crops in the competition. When the judges announced that Samuel's soybeans had taken first place and Thomas's corn had come in second, both men smiled and shook hands. Thomas was genuinely happy for Samuel's win. The ribbon went up on Samuel's wall, but this time it meant something different. It wasn't about proving anything. It was just recognition of good work. In November, Thomas and Samuel started planning a joint project. They'd been talking about it for weeks and they finally decided to go for it. They were going to create an equipment-sharing cooperative for all the farmers in the county. Any member could access expensive machinery without having to buy it themselves. They'd split the costs and the maintenance. It would save everyone money and reduce the financial barriers for new farmers trying to get started. They presented the idea at the next town meeting. The response was overwhelmingly positive. Within 2 months, they had 15 farming families signed up. By spring, they had 30. The Millbrook Farmers Cooperative became a model for other rural communities in the state. Other towns sent representatives to learn how it worked and to start their own versions. Jake and May both decided they wanted to pursue agriculture in college. They talked about maybe coming back to Millbrook after graduation and farming together. Their parents loved that idea. The thought of their kids building on the friendship and cooperation that had been repaired gave both families hope for the future. In December, the town decided to do something special. They commissioned a plaque to be installed in the town square. The dedication ceremony was held on a cold Saturday morning. Most of Millbrook turned out for it. Mayor Henderson gave a short speech about community values and the importance of putting aside differences. Then he unveiled the plaque. It was mounted on a nice stone base with plants around it. The inscription read, "In times of crisis, we remember who we really are. Not competitors, but community." Dedicated to the lesson taught by Thomas Whitaker and Samuel Chen, October 2024. Both families stood together as everyone applauded. Thomas felt Linda squeeze his hand. He looked over at Samuel, who had his arm around Patricia. Their kids were standing with them, smiling. This moment, this community recognition, meant more than any county fair ribbon ever could. Christmas that year felt different in Millbrook. The division that had infected the town for 3 years was gone. People felt free to be friendly with everyone again, without worrying about loyalty to one farmer or the other. The annual Christmas party at the community center was the best attended in years. The energy was positive and warm. Thomas and Samuel showed up to the party together, carrying a massive pot of chili they'd cooked together. It became a tradition after that. Every community event, the two former rivals would cook something together and share it with the town. People joked that their food was better because it was seasoned with reconciliation. By the time spring planting season came around, the transformation was complete. Thomas and Samuel worked their fields side by side, sometimes literally working together on projects that benefited both properties. When one of them had a problem, the other was there to help solve it. When one had a success, the other celebrated it. Other farmers in the area noticed the change. Younger farmers especially saw Thomas and Samuel as examples of how to do things right. Not just the farming techniques, but the attitude, the cooperation, the community focus. Several young people who'd been considering leaving agriculture decided to stick with it, inspired by the model of mutual support they saw in Millbrook. The local church asked Thomas and Samuel to speak one Sunday about their experience. They stood up in front of the congregation and told their story. About pride and rivalry, about the moment of crisis and the choice to help, about rebuilding trust and friendship, about how much richer their lives were now that they were working together instead of competing. "The best crop I harvested last year wasn't soybeans," Samuel said during that talk. "It was friendship. It was community. It was the lesson that we're stronger together than we ever could be apart." Thomas added, "I spent 3 years trying to prove I was better than my neighbor, and I was miserable doing it. Now I spend my time trying to help my neighbor succeed, and I've never been happier. That's the real lesson here. Success isn't about being better than someone else. It's about everyone rising together." The story became part of Millbrook's identity. When new families moved to town, longtime residents would tell them about the two farmers who set aside their rivalry to save a crop and ended up saving their community. It was a story parents told their children. It was a story that got brought up whenever conflicts arose in town, as a reminder that there was always a better way forward than division and competition. Years later, when Thomas and Samuel were both older, and their children had taken over much of the daily farm work, the two men would still meet for coffee every Saturday morning at the diner. They'd talk about crops and weather and grandchildren. They'd argue sometimes about the best way to do something, but it was friendly argument, the kind that made both of them think harder and do better. One Saturday, over their usual coffee and pie, Samuel said, "You know, I can barely remember what we were so mad about for those 3 years." Thomas laughed. "Something about a ribbon, I think. Seems pretty stupid now." "The stupidest thing I ever did was let competition turn into rivalry," Samuel agreed. "But the smartest thing you ever did was bringing those pumps over to my place." "The smartest thing we ever did was choosing to be friends instead of enemies," Thomas corrected. Everything good that came after started with that choice. They finished their coffee and went outside into the sunshine. Their trucks were parked next to each other like always. They'd go home to their separate farms, but they'd see each other later in the week. They'd coordinate equipment sharing for the spring planting. They'd help each other with whatever problems came up. They'd have dinner together with their families. The fence line between their properties was still there, of course. Physical boundaries don't disappear, but the wall they'd built between themselves was gone completely. And in its place was something much better, a bridge, a connection, a friendship that had made both of their lives and their entire community immeasurably better. That's what Millbrook learned from 2 stubborn farmers and 1 flooded field. That it's never too late to make things right. That pride isn't worth losing your community over, and that the best harvest of all is the one you grow together.